Assalamu alaikum, Ramadan Kareem. Welcome to the second edition of the Mashreq Construction Club. Today we will be looking at renegotiating construction contracts. The Mashreq Construction Club was established in 2017 to help create a better construction sector in the UAE and in the GCC. And it's a very important mission. Over the past 5 years, the construction sector has faced many challenges relating to reduced project spending, payment delays, and disputes. And all of this has exposed weaknesses in the industry. And the purpose of the Mashreq Construction Club is really to bring together the construction industry, particularly in the UAE, to look at how we can do things better. Now, over the past few months, the lockdown measures introduced to stop the spread of COVID-19 have added acute new pressures to the construction industry. Governments are shifting their focus onto healthcare spending. Private developers are seeing a fall in revenues. And as a result, the project paymasters across the region, they want to reduce their project costs by renegotiating their construction contracts. The question is, after 5 years of intense pressure on the construction industry, is there actually any scope to reduce construction costs in your contracts? And what is the legal position, and how do you respond to your clients when they're asking for these things? So we will touch on all of these issues in some depth in today's webinars. How can you respond to a client that is seeking to renegotiate the contract, and what are the consequences of the options available to you? We will feature expert insights from Suzannah Newboult, who is a construction partner at DLA Piper, one of the world's biggest law firms, and who has over a decade of experience in GCC construction, and also from Chris Seymour, who is the chair of the MENA advisory panel for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, and he's also managing director of Mott, MacDonald, Middle East. You can submit questions to Suzannah and Chris throughout the webinar using the Q&A button that appears at the bottom of your screen. If you just type in a question, I will field the questions to the panelists, and I will be your moderator for today. I'm Richard Thompson. I'm the editorial director of MEED. But I would like to pass over to Mohammed Al-Shuli, who is our host for today. Mohammed is the Executive Vice President and Global Head of Contracting Finance at Mashreq Bank. And Mashreq Bank is, of course, the owner of the Mashreq Construction Club. So perhaps, Mohammed, if we could just hear a few of your thoughts before we get started on what you'd like to see from today.
Thank you, Richard. Good morning, everyone. I hope you are safe and healthy. On behalf of Mashreq, I welcome you to our second Mashreq Construction Club in its digital format, Connect series. As Richard mentioned, today's topic is a continuation to our previous episode, which revolves around the ever-evolving nature of contract debates and discussions. While negotiating contracts and amendments are a way of life in this industry, it may now be a way of survival for both sides of the contract. In the last 6 weeks, we have seen an emergence of contract cancellation, contract postponement, contract de-scoping, and renegotiation. Some were amicable and others were hostile. Either way, it is happening and will continue to do so aggressively. And there is an opportunity for all parties to make things right. My esteemed colleagues on this panel will elaborate further on such opportunity. So welcome again to Mashreq Construction Club Connect series. Richard.
Thank you very much, Mohammed. And I do invite everyone on the panel, as well as people in the audience, to submit questions and pass on comments, because together we have a lot of experiences and knowledge to share. And the purpose of the panel of the Mashreq Construction Club is to try and use that, pool that community insight together. So just some background, the purpose of the MEED Mashreq Construction Partnership, the Mashreq Construction Club is part of a long-running partnership between MEED and Mashreq, launched in 2017, and it's to support continuous improvement and innovation in the construction industry by providing a forum for ideas and collaboration and knowledge. And you can see on the screen in front of you, we have a dedicated website, the MEED Mashreq Industry Insight Hub, which the URL is on screen. And on that we have research reports, construction club findings reports, webinars, etc. So I invite you to visit that site if you have a chance. Nabil, if we could move to the next slide, please. So this is we're just about to publish in the bottom right-hand corner the 10th report in our research report series. You can see the full series laid out there, and each one touches on a particular topic for focus for improving construction. And all of these are on the hub that I just mentioned. Next slide, Nabil, please. The most recent publication before the Removing Construction Waste report was 2 weeks ago. We published the second white paper from the UAE construction industry think tank, and this was a very focused, high-level focus group of leading figures from across the UAE construction industry, looking at how we can create better contracts in construction in the UAE. The report, the white paper, contains 26 recommendations. You can see the bullet points on the slide. Some of the sort of themes, but it's about how can we create better standard contracts that can remove disputes and avoid disputes and improve efficiency in UAE construction, and ultimately benefit the UAE's and the GCC projects delivery programs. You can download the report by clicking on the link that is shown on the slide. So next slide, please, Nabil. Now, today, the purpose of today, we're looking at renegotiating contracts. As Mohammed said in his opening comment, the project paymasters are coming under intense pressure as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, and that is they are seeking to reduce their project costs by approaching their contractors and suppliers to renegotiate prices and even scope of contract. But that's not a simple thing to do, of course, as everyone knows, and there are many talking points, and I've tried to touch on some of those talking points on here that we will cover today. So how do you respond to a client who is seeking to renegotiate a contract? Are you obliged to renegotiate if the client asks you to? What options are available? What clauses should you be referring to in your contract? Is there even latitude to have significant cost cutting? So there are legal and commercial and technical issues, as well as the whole issue of cash flow and business development that we can talk about today. Please send in your questions if you have any, and as you hear the speakers speaking, and we will try and cover all of this today. So I'd like to introduce our panelists. If we can move to the next slide, please, Nabil. So we have three panelists today. Particularly, we're going to hear from Suzannah Newboult and Chris Seymour. Suzannah Newboult is the construction partner at DLA Piper. DLA Piper is one of the world's biggest law firms, and Suzannah leads their construction practice in this region. She has been in the region for about a decade, just over, working across the region, not just in the UAE, but she is based here in Dubai. And Suzannah is going to touch on some of the legal, technical aspects of renegotiating contracts. We're also very lucky to have Chris Seymour with us today. Chris is the Managing Director of Mott, MacDonald Middle East, one of the biggest consulting engineering firms, multidisciplinary engineering firms in the world. But Chris is also the Chair of the Middle East Advisory Panel for the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, or RICS. Chris will make some comments on the commercial aspects to consider when renegotiating contracts. And of course, Colin Foreman, MEED's Deputy Editor and MEED's Construction Specialist, is also with us today to provide his insights and hopefully ask some challenging questions of our panelists also. And Mohammed, of course, is still with us to take questions if anyone or even if Mohammed himself had some questions on perhaps some of the financing aspects of what's going on as well. So that is your panel. I've spoken for long enough. I'm now going to hand over to Suzannah to start off with covering some of the legal issues. And please send your questions as they come in. I will field them once the speakers have finished. Over to you, Suzannah.
Thank you very much, Richard. If I could have the next slide, please. I'm going to cover three key aspects here. So firstly, the question that's asked mostly of me, as a contractor, do I have to renegotiate? And then if you are renegotiating, what should that renegotiation look like? What should it include? Because it's not just about the price. And then finally, a quick look at, is there an alternative you can offer the client if they ask you for a lower price? Next slide, please. So, in answer to do you have to renegotiate? Well, the first question is, do you have a contract? And quite often in this region, we see that projects are started, contractors start on site with only a letter of intent in place, pending the more formal contract terms to be put in place at a later date. And those contracts, I think, or rather those projects are more vulnerable to requests to renegotiate the price. But your letter of intent could be a contract. So you need to have a look at your letter of intent. If it's not, if it is purely a case of it's a letter of intent that states on its face that it's not the contract or it's subject to contract, then there's no issue, no legal question to consider. It's a commercial question as to whether you want to renegotiate or whether you need to renegotiate the price to keep the project. Now, how do you know if your letter of intent is a contract? Well, if it doesn't have those express wordings saying it's not, then does it contain the essential terms of a contract? So in this case, we would be looking at, does it contain the scope of works? Usually letters of intent do incorporate by reference the tender documents. So usually the scope of works is in there. And does it include the price? Likely. And does it include the period that you need to carry out the works? Because if it has all of those things, and the parties that signed it were legally able to sign and bind the companies, then you've probably got a contract. What does that mean? Do I have to renegotiate? Well, no. You've got a binding agreement as to the price. You might actually have a more formal contract in place, such as a FIDIC-based contract. And so moving over to the darker side of the slide there, what that means, again, you can expect that both parties will be bound by their agreed price in the contract. However, you do need to consider what will happen if you don't renegotiate. There is a risk that the client believes it can make a substantial saving by engaging someone else to finish the works if you're not prepared to lower your price. In which case, they may seek to terminate or de-scope the rest of your works. And I know that you're all thinking, well, can they do that? And it's a question that I'm regularly asked. Can they terminate me? Well, most of the contracts we see in this region do have provisions for termination for convenience or at will by the client. Now, if you're starting from a FIDIC standpoint, FIDIC Red Book doesn't allow termination for convenience if the client is going to replace you with another contractor or get someone else to do those works. But typically here, we see that restriction removed. So if the client is able to terminate for convenience, you need to be looking at what it is happens on that termination. And again, if you're looking at something FIDIC based, it probably says that the contract is only entitled to the costs that it's incurred to date and those reasonable expenses that's incurred in anticipation of completing works. If, however, you are lucky enough to be in a position where the contract either doesn't specify that the client's able to terminate for convenience or doesn't say what happens, then happily the underlying law, whilst it will allow the client to terminate for convenience, or it will also require the client to pay your loss of profit. Also on termination, just think about force majeure. We've talked a lot about that over the last few weeks. If either party has served a force majeure notice, then it's usual for the contract to specify that after a certain period, and it's 84 days in FIDIC, either party will be able to serve notice to terminate if the works have been unable to substantially progress during that 84 days. And the consequences of that are the same. The contract is paid for the works is done to date. And then there's de-scoping, a popular ruse or favourite ruse during the global financial crisis. And we're not going to terminate the contractor, we're just going to de-scope the entire rest of the works. So in FIDIC, again, you wouldn't be able to do that if those works are going to someone else, if it's unamended, but typically we see that amended here too, in which case, provided the client is able to omit works, as they usually are with variations, then there's nothing to stop them freely de-scoping significant aspects of the works. So, if you have a contract, no, you don't have to renegotiate. But obviously you need to weigh up the risks. And after you've weighed up the risks of that, you may want to do so. Could I have the next slide, please? So if you are renegotiating, what should that look like? What do you need to think about? Because it's not just about the price. Well, there are some things you absolutely need to deal with in that renegotiation. So first of all, of course, a revised time for completion. It's likely that there's been some delay, and you need to cover off what your new time for completion will be. You need to cover off any existing claims, because it will be extremely difficult to unravel those after you've entered into a renegotiated price. And actually, it's likely that the client will want this renegotiation of price to also be a full and final settlement of all claims to that point. If your project's been suspended, think about doing a health check. And that way you know exactly what or have got a better idea of what your exposure is, because that needs to be covered in the renegotiation. Think about those things that deteriorate when they're left on site. And think about the effect on manufacturers' warranties that you're obliged to hand over at completion. How old will they be? Bonds, if your price is going to reduce, your bond should reduce. Get that agreed in your renegotiation. And delay damages. We often see delay damages here expressed as a percentage of the contract price. And certainly, we almost always see a 10% cap on delay damages. Or make sure that your contract mechanism, the wording of that contract and the definitions used for contract price will also cover your renegotiated lower price, so your capped lower. And really importantly, expressly deal with COVID-19 second wave. Because it won't be, from this point onwards, unforeseeable that there will be a second wave, or there could be a second wave. And if you have agreed and renegotiated a price that includes the effect of COVID-19, the client's going to say that included the effects of a second wave of COVID-19. So make sure you deal with that. A couple of points in the centre there for you to consider, but perhaps not with the same consequences. So advanced payment repayments. If you're continuing to repay your advance payments as a percentage of the monthly applications that are going in, but your monthly applications are based on a lower price, then there's going to be a balancing payment due back to the client at the end. And think about what you're doing with the bill of quantities rates. Are you leaving them as they are? Because if you do, those bill of quantity rates, which build up to the original contract price, will mean that your monthly applications for payments will cumulatively amount to an amount greater than your revised contract price. So you're going, or in other words, you're going to use up your contract price faster. Now, I put those just for consideration in the centre because it might well be that you say, well, we want to leave those as they are because that front loads payments to us and helps our cash flow. And finally, on the right-hand side of the slide, opportunities. What's in it for you? If you've got to enter into a renegotiation to lower your price, you ought to be looking to get something back for that. And that might be around your payment terms. So can you agree a shorter payment period? Or can you agree fortnightly applications instead of monthly ones? And are there other things to consider in terms of your cash flow too? What about agreeing a release of retention? Or that no further deduction of retention will take place in relation to payments going forward? Cash flow issues to help. Thank you. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd just like to think about what are the possible alternatives if your client asks you for a lower price. Well, really, this is on a case-by-case basis because it really depends on what the client's motivations are going to be. So it really helps if you understand the client's position and what drives them, what their objectives are. But things for you to consider: was it a particularly complex project or over-engineered in terms of what's now required? If so, can you offer an aggressive value engineering? Rather than doing the same works for a lower price, is there a way you can agree that those works are altered to meet an acceptable price? And along similar lines, what about de-scoping or omitting elements of the works that are perhaps no longer going to be required? So de-scoping by agreement. And finally, what about agreeing perhaps a fairer way for both parties in relation to a response to the COVID-19 pressures? Perhaps a cost reimbursable mechanism. Okay, the contractor may have to agree a lower profit, if it can, but on the basis that it will be paid for all of its costs. Of course, this would have to be on an open book basis, but the client would then have confidence that they're only paying for the works that are going to be carried out, and they're not paying for any priced in risk or anything like that. So it could be a fairer way for the parties to deal with a COVID-19 situation.
Wonderful. That was a fantastic summary of the key points, Suzannah. Thank you very much. Now, we've had a few questions coming in already. What I propose to do is keep the questions until after Chris has done his comments. I do invite people to take the opportunity to submit questions because we've got some very, very excellent and experienced people speaking today, and it's a good opportunity to ask them things that might be of concern to you. So keep the questions coming. I'm now going to move across to Chris. Suzannah just summarised some of the sort of legal things to think about in regards to renegotiating contracts. And at the end there she talked about, in the final slide, about value engineering and de-scoping. So that leads us neatly into some of the commercial elements of renegotiating contracts. So Chris Seymour is the Managing Director of Mott, MacDonald Middle East and the Chair of the MENA Advisory Panel for RICS, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors. Chris, I think you're going to set out 5 keynote points that you're going to talk to for a few minutes, then we'll get into the Q&A. So over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks very much, Richard, and thank you, Suzannah, also for that introduction. As Richard says, I'm going to talk about some of the commercial aspects of a renegotiation. And rather than talk about it in terms of an aggressor and a victim, I'm going to address it in terms of two parties coming together looking to successfully renegotiate a contract. And the considerations usually fall into four areas. I'm just going to quickly run through those. The first of which is really looking at the commercial capacity in the market. And the key consideration here is to look at whether the market has gone from a position of premium pricing to a position where those premiums have come out and there is no longer any surplus in the market. In those circumstances, there may be something for a client to recover from their contract. Now, if we look at examples, the clear example is back in 2008. There was definitely premium pricing across most of the elements of materials, plant, and labour. And in those circumstances, we were actually in real estate. We were actually seeing some of the construction projects on a per square metre basis, probably costing out at probably twice what you'd expect today. And so, as the market came down, those premiums washed out of the system, and so in a way, clients were correct in looking for that renegotiation on price, and most of them were indeed quite successful because there was a big drop down to something that was more normal. Now, if we compare that market to the market today, we do not have those same conditions, and those premiums, that premium pricing does not exist, and hence those surpluses do not exist either. It was already a tight market when we went into this crisis, and so we're now in a very different situation. If you look at pricing, the market pretty much bottomed out in Q4 2011, and from a construction pricing perspective, was probably at its lowest in first quarter 2012. Now, between then and now, pricing has had a little bit of a wild ride. So certainly metals have been up and down. But if you really look at between 2012 and 2020, the increase is probably only in the order of around 8 to 10%. And so certainly we are still looking at a tight market, and therefore under this particular heading, you would say those opportunities honestly are not there. The second thing to think about is really looking at project drivers. And when you have a difficult market, quite often the drivers of a project also change. So in terms of real estate, you may be looking at a project that was considered to be fitted out. You may want that to look at more of a shell and core option, or indeed if it was going to be a shell and core project, you may actually consider making it more attractive to the market and fitting it out. So in other words, those outcomes could shift. And that really is where it would be better to focus the negotiation rather than around purely a cost reduction initiative. We can also see this in utilities, where if there is a demand risk coming in because of the changed market, you might want to look at that from the perspective of more of a modular approach than a single package approach as well. So this is around reassessing the project in terms of its outcomes rather than just its outturn cost. Third thing is really around the placing of risk. In the Middle East, most construction across most sectors, in fact, is on a fixed price basis. So there's quite a bit of fixed price in there, risk in there around such things as certainly labour, materials, even soft costs, and sometimes even tax. Now, it may be in the client's interest to actually unwind some of that risk, take some of that risk on, and that might actually reveal some savings that the provider might be happy to pass on to the client. It may be not an overall approach. It may be in specific areas, specific supplies, or actually risk around specific regulations. By relaxing those risks and the client taking those risks on board, which may not be a big deal to the client, might release some cash out of the project. This particular theme gets quite quickly onto actually talking about different forms of procurement and more collaborative forms of procurement, which can be far more agile. I think that's probably a question we can address later on, Richard. Then coming to the final thing is really around the use of investment. The Middle East is a land of heavy bonding and also quite high working capital. And what clients can do is look at the bonding, first of all, to see whether that security package around the performance bond is needed at all, bearing in mind the type of construction, where it has got to in the project. But also, a very easy thing is to look at whether you can change open-ended bonding to date-limited bonding or closed-end bonding. From a banking perspective, I'm sure Mohammed would agree, this is a very different deal to open-end, and also potentially moving it from on-demand to conditional as well. Just by doing that, releases some of the costs from the contractor or provider, and they can in fact be passed back to the client. And then I think the final thing I'll come on to is really the point of cash, which I think is probably the headline reason that many participants are actually on this call. By actually releasing some of the working capital into projects, then there may well be a deal to be done with the provider. Most contractors and consultants are needing cash at these difficult times, and just by helping that cash flow can actually help your project. And there may be something there that a deal can be done where those costs can be handed back. Back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Chris. That was a fantastic summary of some very big themes there. We're probably only going to be able to touch the tip of the iceberg on most of this today, but certainly a lot to come back to. The questions are coming in, and please keep them coming. We've got 30 minutes to discuss this. And Colin and Mohammed, you're both on the line as well, and you may also wish to ask points or make points or ask questions. Before I go to the submitted questions, Mohammed, it looks like you might have something that you want to say.
Yes, thanks, Richard. Chris, I agree with you on the last point, where now it's an opportunity to relook at the bonding and the texts of those guarantees. We all understand here in our industry that most of these bonds are financial guarantees, pay upon first demand, and they have either an auto-renewable clause or an open-ended expiry. Now, this is one issue which is I agree with you, could be negotiated and should be negotiated. However, other elements of these guarantees, like the abruptness of the call on it, it has no connection to performance. It has no connection to the state of that project, completed. And I believe that it could be one of those ways where these bonds should relate directly to the performance of the contract rather than as an added security that is put on the side used towards the end when parties are negotiating heavily and hardly to conclude a contract. We have suggested several times that a call on a bond may need to have a window where people could actually get together and try to resolve it amicably instead of being called immediately. So these are ideas that needs to now the industry needs to consider, and the industry needs to shape its opinion and move away from the old standard types of guarantees that we issue.
Sure, and I think one of the things is that in particular times like this, when the market becomes disrupted, we'd actually have an opportunity of time. Sometimes the time is not needed so much in the project context, and we can use that time to have healthy debate around the point of the bonds and guarantees, and also some of the other aspects that both Suzannah and I mentioned earlier.
I wonder, Chris, can I just, before we go to the Q&A, is your general sense, and maybe Suzannah, Mohammed, and Colin, you all might have a comment on this, is there a general sense that we're in this together, and there is, we want to move beyond the traditional kind of adversarial approach, and everyone is feeling the pain, and therefore there is an opportunity for greater collaboration than we would normally see in construction? Chris, do you see any sense of that, or is that a bit naive?
I think it's patchy, honestly, Richard. There are some there's some responses we're seeing out there that are absolutely on this basis, and a number of clients are looking at it in the way of this. using the renegotiation as an opportunity to think ahead of what contracting might look like in the future. One of the advantages of a more collaborative approach to contracting is that it gives you agility and adaptability. So when you're actually hit by one of these problems in the market, you've got a far easier rule book to work by to actually get the outcomes you need, rather than this confrontational basis that we're faced with now. But as Mohammed opened with, there have also been some pretty aggressive approaches as well. I think you'd agree.
Okay. Okay, I'd like to move on to the Q&A now. We've got quite a lot of questions coming in. And so I'll start, Suzannah, with some of the legal ones. And if you think that one of the other panelists might have a better or a different take, then please just nominate someone. But this first one here, it says, I work for a client, and if we decide to apply a de-scoping option, do we have to compensate lost profit related to the amount of de-scoped work to the contractor?
It will depend on what your contract says, but provided that your contract allows you to de-scope, or more usually omit, works in the variation provisions, and that's as far as it goes. There's no requirement on the face of it or under the law that says you're required to pay for loss of profit for that.
And a follow-up question also from the client side. This question says, due to the economic crisis and the effects beyond the COVID pandemic, what types of term do we put to reduce the cost and risk? Please be reminded that we haven't prepared a contract yet. Okay, so if somebody's looking forward here about how do they prepare.
Yeah, I think people are going to spend a lot more time scrutinising force majeure clauses and the like before they enter into new contracts now, and rightly so. So ensuring that there is provision in there that covers pandemic or epidemic specifically would be helpful. But also think a bit broader than that and think about the experiences that we're seeing now. Actually, it's not always COVID-19 that's causing the problem. So it's not necessarily the fact that some of the staff are infected. It could be more likely that there's a government restriction on moving the labourers, or you're unable to get the materials into the country because there's a flight ban. Now, they ultimately might be a result, or the reason behind that might be COVID-19. But when you're looking at the event that has caused you the delay or problem, it may well not be actually COVID-19. So think about those things and make sure that when you're drafting those force majeure provisions or negotiating those provisions, and also those change in law provisions, make sure that they're wide enough to capture all that. And actually, one point there on the change in law provisions is they're often drafted reasonably widely, but do remember a lot of the things we've seen put in place in the last few weeks don't come under the heading of formal sort of laws. They're not even all directives. Some of them are purely just circulars from the government. So make sure that what a law is in that context is really widely drafted.
So there's a couple of questions have come in saying, is COVID-19 a force majeure event? And I think, Suzannah, you've just answered that in the sense that it depends on what's in your contract, what's been amended, what the local laws are, etc., etc. For those of you who weren't here 2 weeks ago, our previous webinar was on force majeure, and on the Mashreq Industry Insights Hub, you will be able to see that video as well. But I think Suzannah just touched on that. One interesting point, Suzannah, which in your slide, you said, if there is a second wave, that then changes it from being something that was unforeseeable to something that's eminently foreseeable. So presumably, it won't be a force majeure event, or it's very difficult to argue that if there is a second wave.
If you've got a renegotiated contract. So if you haven't touched your contract at all, then the foreseeable or unforeseeable requirement is at the time you sign the contracts. So you may still be okay in that sense. But if you're renegotiating the contract and you're resetting contract price at a point in time, then you can well imagine that the client will argue that price was set understanding the risks and to encompass any further effects of the force majeure as you're wrapping up, if you like, the effects of what's gone before as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to give one more question to you, Suzannah, because you've answered a few in a row and you probably need a break, and then I'll have a few for Chris. This is for Suzannah. So can the client go back to those works that have already been certified and ask for a discount?
Well, I'm sure they can ask, but there's no legal requirement for that to be accepted, or for you to enter into renegotiations on that. You're entitled to consider that you're bound by the contract that you entered into. And Richard, if I may, before you move on, just in terms of that de-scoping question, because I wouldn't like people to go away and think, right, it's simple. What we do now is just de-scope 100% of the contract works, and then we don't have to do any kind of termination or anything like that. I think it would be a question of degree. So, if you've got 30% left, then that could be legitimately a de-scope, and nothing's going to, there'll be no difficulties with that under the law. If, though, you're right at the beginning of the contract, then I think there's going to be an argument that actually it was more tantamount to a termination scenario, or that you're showing you're not intended to be bound by that contract. And so then I think that you would end up in an argument there that possibly it was, in fact, a de facto termination of the contract, and that the contractor should be entitled to compensation for that. So I just wanted to clarify that it is a matter of degree.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a couple of questions have come in about the availability of the slides and the video. Yes, the slides will be available to all, everyone who's attending today, and the video also will be available. It takes a couple of days to edit the video for the final format, and we will put it up on the Mashreq Heartland on MEED.com on our YouTube channel, so you can see the video on demand, and the slides will be shared as well with everyone who's attending today. So Chris, if I can come across to you then. So I have a couple of questions here. This one is, and I'm just going to read it, so I don't know where the emphasis will be, but in case of reducing the scope quantity of approximately 50% due to a change in design, do we have the right to ask for variation or by increasing the unit rate, noting that it is mentioned in the contract and that it's remeasurable and the rates are fixed unit rates?
It's a good. That's a great question. If there's so starting at the top there, if there's a change in design, effectively it's changed the scope of the contract. So absolutely, there is a variation there. The connection between the unit rates in the contract and that varied design will actually be based around what physically what the outcome of that work is. So if it is wholly different to the existing contract, then you would be able to go outside those unit rates, and it'd be based on a fair and reasonable valuation. But if it is of similar construction elements to what is actually in the contract, then it would be based on those unit rates in the contract. But fundamentally, if there has been a substantial change in the design, then you would be due a variation. And I think that goes back to one of the probably the better approach than asking for a discount is really looking at the change needed in the contract.
Okay, thank you very much. There's a question here. I'm going to put it to you, Chris, but possibly it's for Suzannah as well. So due to COVID-19, there is a big impact on materials supply and on the materials supply chain. What elements should be considered from this in renegotiating a contract?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll give you the I'll give you my view, and Suzannah, you can follow up to tell me if I'm right or not. But if the restriction in supply is something that's directly related to the incidents and the restrictions around COVID-19, then it will fall into the force majeure consideration. But if it independent from that, then it may well be a risk that the contractor has to take. How do you read that, Suzannah?
I agree entirely. I would expand it slightly to say that it might not be a straight force majeure scenario, or you might not want to rely on force majeure scenario. You might also think about change in law. Again, coming back to that idea that governments have imposed restrictions, and it could be that the government directive in terms of goods coming into the country or goods going out of another country is actually what's caused it, as opposed to the force majeure. And I say that because it's sometimes more advantageous to use change in law provisions depending on...
That's quite true, actually. Yeah, quite true. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a lot of questions coming in on similar themes, so I'm going to try and group the questions around themes, if I can. So at the moment we're talking about the supply chain and materials, so I'll try and focus on the questions for a few minutes that are about that. So Chris, I think this is for you. Can modifications to project specifications addressed during renegotiation? Can modifications to project specifications during renegotiation, for example, changes of country of origin? I don't know if I've expressed that question really. I guess the question is about how much detail can be changed.
I think it depends actually where that's driven. If it's driven from a client perspective, so they're asking consideration of a different material. If it's different country of origin, it probably means it's a different supply. If that is effectively a different specified supply, then again that would be a normal variation, and indeed that might drive either speed or it might drive saving. If it's something that you are offering in as part of the negotiation, and then to a certain extent normal rules apply. You'd be saying, okay, well, we have an alternative supply for this material. It's faster, cheaper. Can we have a look at that in terms of the around this negotiation that you're wanting to undertake?
Okay, thank you. Now another supplier question here. So I think probably, Chris, this is for you initially. Being a supplier, bracket manufacturer, if we reduce our prices, but due to the restriction in labour movement, it will increase the cost of labour. So the manufacturer's costs go up, even though they have to reduce their prices. How can we cope with this issue and get benefit to reduce prices? I'm guessing this touches on the value engineering element, but what's the situation, do you think, for manufacturers and suppliers in this scenario? Is it the same as for contractors?
Yeah. Yes. Well, to a certain extent, I think it sounds to me that the question is from a supplier manufacturer. Whilst they have a lower cost of raw materials, the input cost of labour has gone up. If that is and again, it goes back to probably the earlier consideration. If it's directly related to COVID-19, then they may have a remedy, or indeed, if it is because of maybe because of government action, then equally they would have that same remedy as Suzannah explained before. If it is a subcontraction, you're actually talking about the labour on site, then that might be slightly different. But what I'm understanding is a manufacturing piece. This.
Okay. Now we've got loads of questions coming in, so I won't be able to dwell too much on any one. Suzanne, I think this is maybe a legal one then. So are clients imposing discounts when they have not suffered, or what if clients are imposing discounts when they've not suffered any demonstrable loss? Are they simply taking advantage of the current situation? Maybe this is for Chris as well, but is the demonstrable loss element, is that quite important in this?
Well, going back to the point that if you have a contract in place, you're entitled to consider that to be honoured. So there is no way a client can impose a discount. They can negotiate and agree a discount, or if they're simply doing it by not paying you, then you still maintain your legal rights and you're entitled to the rest of it. So the client's not actually allowed to just impose it. But beyond that, I don't think whether the client suffered a demonstrable loss or not really comes into that question.
No.
That tends to come up more when you're looking at things like when they're levying damages for your delay. Did they actually suffer a loss as a result of your delay? And some arguments could be raised around that, but not directly in terms of just enforcing a discount.
No, I think I would agree with that as well, Suzannah. It really goes back to the point that there's nothing wrong with the client asking for a discount, and there's nothing wrong with a contractor or provider entertaining that request. And in terms of just a direct cost saving, usually the only way it comes together is if there's a synchronization between a deterioration in the client's market and a washout of the premiums and surpluses that we saw in 2018 that might actually bring those the clients together. So on the one hand, in the days, you had clients with substantially lower value outcomes to their projects, and you had a contracting community that actually wanted to hang on to the contract to maintain cash flow. And so in those instances, contractors were happy to give up those premiums that they were no longer having to pay. But there's, in terms of client needing to demonstrate a loss, I don't think that really comes into it now.
Okay, thank you. So, Suzannah, in most contracts, there is a clause which gives the client the right to terminate for convenience. In the absence of a court ruling to consider COVID as force majeure, how can this be argued? I hope that question makes sense. I've just read it as it's written. I think it's asking about the termination for convenience element.
Well, it's the law allows the client to terminate for convenience if the contract allows the client to terminate for convenience. So it may simply just operate that clause. So the question tends to be, or what's more important to the contracts tends to be what happens as a result and what they're entitled to in terms of payments. Now, I know that there's some confusion around this because the law says that on the face of it, you need a court order to terminate a contract, and that all gets a bit confusing. If the parties agree then that's not the case. The parties can agree that for a termination, but equally, the situation where a client terminates for convenience, although it's not expressly written in the law that that's allowed, unlike Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, where it is in the civil code that they can terminate for convenience, it is generally accepted here in the UAE that is an exception to the binding nature of the contract because it's a construction contract, because it's a long-term ongoing contract. So they are by law able to terminate at will, as we would say, or for convenience, as well as there being that requirement in most, or that ability in most of the contracts themselves. So that's sort of how they would go about it. I hope that's answered the question.
I think so. I mean, you can, if your questions are only being partially answered, or if you have follow-up questions, please send in a follow-up comment. We're not going to be able to answer everything today because we're getting so many, but we will follow up where we can. We'll share the questions with the panelists, and we'll try and give you as much value out of this as we can. Suzannah, another one for you. So with regards to entitlement to loss of profit in the event of a termination, excluding convenience, what limit of financial recourse is generally observed in arbitration awards? For example, remaining profit derived from outstanding contract sum, or a duration calculation until such time as the contractor can obtain other work.
Okay. Well, the starting point tends to be that the contractors we put in the position they would have been in had the contract have continued for its duration. So in that sense, it's linked to the loss of profit under that contract, for that project itself. If you're looking at it from, and you're applying just the law because the contract doesn't have conditions, it will approach it that way too, but the law will take account of any sort of mitigating factors. So if the contractor has picked up new work and therefore doesn't suffer a loss because he's not working during that period, then that will mitigate the award that the court makes in terms of loss of profit. So in answer to the question, it is about the loss on that project, but, and if you're stepping outside of a contractual mechanism around that, and you happen to apply the law, then it might be that that is reduced if indeed you don't suffer that loss of profit because you've got other projects.
Okay, thank you. To give Suzannah a moment to catch her breath, I'll come to you, Chris, with this one, but you might pass it back. How can subcontractors protect themselves in these COVID-19 circumstances if the main contractor terminates the contract quoting force majeure? I presume it's the same calculation if your client is a developer or a main contractor, or it's the same set of principles, I guess.
Fundamentally, the contract's likely to be slightly different, but in terms of the outcome, the fundamentals are the same. Yes, and there is evidence in the market that this is taking place. But to hand it back to Suzannah, I don't know how often are you hearing about this?
I think there are. We are seeing notices flying around a lot at this time. Interestingly, rarely, if you scrutinise those notices, do they fulfil the requirements for notices in the contracts, because the information that the contracts require just isn't available in many cases. So in terms of sort of protecting yourself if you're receiving one of those, then if you're looking at that and you think strictly it doesn't apply or it doesn't fulfill the requirements, then you ought to be saying that, because further down the line, if you need to have an argument about this, it might be that you can say that actually it wasn't applicable at the time, and that it just as a matter of fact wasn't the situation. We weren't stopped from doing this, or or we could have still delivered, or we know that actually they could have continued with the project, but they chose not to for other reasons. Anything around that, but the best sort of timelessly advice is to just make sure that your position's clear on that in response.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've got so many questions. I apologise in advance. There's no way we can answer them all in the time that remains. We will do our best to reply by email and maybe in future webinars as well. A lot of the questions do relate to force majeure, and Suzannah has already set out several points on force majeure in this webinar, and we do have the webinar from 2 weeks ago which was all about force majeure. So there is a lot of content that I think does answer some of these. If you have a look on the MEED.com or on the Mashreq Industry Insights Hub, and of course we can try and answer by email. I'm going to do 2 more questions which are about price calculations. So I'll go to you, Chris. The first one is, in such uncertainty, how can we calculate the right prices for material and labour to be on the safe side? So how do you handle this if you're trying to submit prices?
Really difficult, and I think this is because the typical conundrum that everyone's in at the moment is you're looking to you need to make sure that you can keep your order book up and trying to carry you're trying to manage an unknown risk going forward, but not actually price yourself out of the competition. So it is really difficult. One of the ways that I think it probably brings us back to one of the earlier points, which is this is where open book methods of procurement really do lend themselves, because you can get far more adaptability and agility in an uncertain market. And really what you're doing there, it's actually around a risk share. And I think that this is one of the reasons that this is, I mean, it's certainly one of the main themes of for the RICS in this particular region, is even before we had this crisis actually, but is actually to look at how we can start moving towards a far more amicable and far more even spread of risk for contracting going forward, and crisis like this absolutely typifies that. And I do feel for particularly for subcontractors, but honestly the whole supply chain in trying to handle those fixed price risks going forwards. It's not easy. Offering an open book approach to a client, there is nothing wrong with that, and could also be seen as a method of, from a client's perspective, and they should see it like this, is how we advise, is that potentially going forward, there may actually be some, once all this is washed through and we're into what everybody's calling the new normal, there may actually be savings to take. So it might actually be an advantageous way through, rather than expecting the supply chain to price risk the whole thing.
Okay, I'm going to have one more question, Chris, for you, and then we're going to have to bring the webinar to a close. So I do apologise in advance for everyone whose questions we haven't had time to get to today. This, I think, goes to your first point on your slide about value rather than cost. This has come from the client side and the project client side, and I think it's to you, Chris. How would you advise your clients in response to the scale or the volume of percentage of reduction? Would you advise them to seek a 50% reduction, a 20% reduction, a 10% reduction? There's a bit of a killer question. Obviously, there's no fixed answer, but I think perhaps it relates to your sort of first point in your slide.
I think it does, and I can almost imagine which organisation it might have come from. I think the point is that fundamentally there is very little slack left in the market. It was a tight market anyway. Towards the end of last year, there was already clouds of recession on the horizon. We were not in a high oil price environment at all, and so there is very little left in terms of that surplus to take out. And so I would always recommend to actually look at those change in project outcomes to see what. There are very few projects that have not changed because of what we can see coming up, and it's really looking at those outcomes, one, and the second thing is looking at a different spread of risk, and out of that that applicable percentage will be derived. I honestly think there's a really good conversation to have between client and supply chain, and it probably actually comes back to one of the earlier questions, is when clients are open about what they're going through in terms of their business, it enables the supply chain to then become better synchronized with their business and find ways to actually get to the right result for both parties. And I think that can, if looking to the future, it may not benefit us now, but looking to the future, if we can look at contracting models that actually enable that, I think we're going to be in a better place when something like this might happen again.
Okay, thank you. I said I would not ask another question, but I am going to break my word now, because there is one here that I think we haven't talked much about bonding today, and there is a question. So this might be from Mohammed or Suzannah, I think, but it relates to force majeure. Are we seeing on-demand bonds being protected by the force majeure mechanism? I don't know if this is one for you, Mohammed, or one for Suzannah from a legal point of view. Is there any connection there?
Well, from a bank's point of view, everybody needs to understand that the guarantees that the banks are issuing are guarantees that are a contract on its own. the way the texts are, it does not really connect to the contract that is signed between two parties. And the only governing law for these guarantees are the jurisdiction that is mentioned in the text of the guarantee itself. And therefore, if there is let's say, a position around whether the bond should be paid or not, this is something that needs to be decided by the court that is within the jurisdiction of that contract. But none of those guarantees have explicitly that mentioned.
Okay, thank you very much. Suzannah, do you want to make any final comment on that point before we round up the session?
No, I mean, that was spot on, the right answer. The bank's sort of a bit stuck in terms of what it can do. And that the on-demand bond is an on-demand bond. Unless you can get to court and request an interim application, a measure to prevent the bank having to pay out in a very short period of time, and that has been a problem because the force majeure scenario has meant that the courts have been operating in different ways and different mechanisms, and it's been difficult to get powers of attorney to even start cases in order to do that. Then the bank has to pay out. Now, whether force majeure is then protection for you will come much later. So it might be the way in which you are able to recover the monies that have been paid out into the bond, but it might not be enough to stop the bond being paid out.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to bring the discussion to an end because we're already over time. We will say a few thank yous in a moment, but umbrella thank you just now. I'm going to hand over to Mohammed just to pass on, to give some closing remarks as our host today and as the owner of the Mashreq Construction Club. It's always important, I think, for Mohammed to set out some of his thoughts on this, and then we shall close the session. So, Mohammed, if you could perhaps make a few observations on what you've heard today.
Thank you all for being with us today. Feel free to reach out to us anytime for any inquiry or a suggestion on future topics. We are there to try to provide as much as we can the knowledge and the collaboration amongst this huge and highly important industry. Again, I encourage every company out there to reach out to their banker for any help required during this difficult time. This is Mashreq. Stay safe, stay connected.
Thank you. That's a great way to finish. So thank you to our panelists today, to Suzannah, to Chris. Colin, thank you for being present with support, but obviously we had a lot of stuff to get through with Suzannah and Chris. It was a fantastic set of presentations. We will share the slides, as I mentioned, with everyone who's attended, and the video will be online in a couple of days. Please watch out. There are so many topics that have come up, and we will go through your questions to identify key themes for future webinars. The Mashreq Construction Club Connect series will be hosting webinars at this time every Thursday, every 2 weeks, and we will just keep going until to satisfy interest. So please keep the comments and the ideas coming. We will try and do as much as we can to help you through all of this. Thank you all for coming then, and I think that's everything. Stay safe and see you next time. Thank you very much.